access to justice for business-related human rights abuses remains a huge challenge. We heard this morning that despite the progress and several promises made, there is still a contrast between progress at the top and reality on the ground, and that human rights defenders and rights holders continue to suffer. We also heard that while there's a lot of progress that has been made on national action plans in Asia and legislation globally, but we keep also seeing there's an increased attention on civil society advocacy through social media campaigns, shareholder regulations, and various other complaints mechanisms that the civil society organizations and other rights holders have started using. We call these as pressure points, and we've been working very closely with the civil society organizations and human rights defenders here in the region. I kind of feel that sometimes affected rights holders are either not fully aware or do not have or lack the capacity to actually also use fully the mechanisms that are available, well, albeit imperfect grievance mechanisms, but we also see that there is a gap between the ones that are available and the way that they have been used. I mean, as I said, we call these as pressure points. And we've been exploring these, like what these other additional pressure points are that the civil society organizations and the defenders and the right holders can use to hold businesses accountable. And to discuss that today, I have a very illustrious panel here with me. Professor Surya Deva, he's the professor at Macquarie Law School and director of the Center for Environmental Law at Macquarie University. Ms. Leah Torres, executive director, Center for Environmental Concern. She's also the youth activist for the Blood Money campaign. Dr. Phil Wong, who's the executive director at the Gong Hong Human Rights Law Foundation. He's also the adjunct professor at International Human Rights Law Clinic at Seoul University Law School. And then last not the least, we also have with us Ms. Sophia Arias. She's the program director at the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. Thank you for joining us today. Surya, we've been having a lot of conversation about pressure points. We've been also just sort of starting this partnership with UNDP and the Macquarie University to use pressure points as one of the key, or at least to sort of start discussions around pressure points. So could you please explain what these pressure points are and how they're different from other strategies and tools to hold businesses accountable?
Thank you, Harpreet. Some of you were in the CSO session yesterday where I was talking about my helplessness as in my former role as a member of the working group, that I could not help enough the affected communities and the victims on the ground to seek access to remedy. So what can we do? So this project, which has been kindly funded in the initial phase by UNDP as well, is going to explore what these pressure points are and how that interface is going to look like with other elements of justice reveal mechanism. So in this brief presentation, I will quickly explain what this concept of pressure points is, and I suspect many of you in the room may be using those pressure points, but without knowing it. So this project is trying to provide a framework, a cohesive framework, so that can be used by anyone in the world. And basically what we are talking about here are those entry points that are likely to trigger action on the part of business leaders who take decisions. That they have to take the actions of their companies, of course, but also the victims seriously, and they have to address those concerns, because prevention is never foolproof, in my view. And that's where access to remedy is very crucial, and of course remedies could also be preventive in nature. So I think we are in Thailand, so I thought I will put this picture about massage is very common in Thailand, but also we have this whole science about acupressure. So we have those points, and if we apply the pressure properly, that will result some change. So I'm using this as an analogy for this idea of pressure points in the context of business and human rights, that what are those points to which businesses react? And once you put pressure on those points, then businesses, hopefully, if we assume that they are rational actors, they will start taking the concerns of civil society groups and human rights defenders seriously, and then hopefully that will address some of these concerns on the ground. So what are those potential points of pressure that businesses may look at? You see some of these examples on this slide. So image. So if a company has a visibility, it is listed on a stock exchange, that could be a point that they would like to protect. The issues about investors and consumers could be potential pressure points because ultimately companies would like to buy their products and services to be used. They would like people to work for companies, so that could be a pressure point. So youth, for instance, if they don't want to work for company X, that could be a point that could be exploited in my view. So these are some of the points. Now, increasingly, companies and businesses are trying to have partnership with UN agencies. But should it be a blank check of the partnership with UN agencies, or should that be used as a leverage point, as a pressure point? And I think these are some of the examples that you see on the slides. Now, what is the relevance of it? Because if you look at Pillar 3 of the UNGPs, it talks about 3 broad mechanisms where you can seek access to remedy. So how this idea of pressure points fits into Pillar 3? And my understanding is that that is the interrelationship. So pressure points are broader concepts. They operate sometimes overlapping with judicial or non-judicial mechanisms, but sometimes they will be standing outside of those mechanisms, and they will basically try to complement. The idea is that by triggering and using those pressure points, either the affected communities will get access to remedy directly, and that is something you see on this slide. That is one possibility. That let us say you write a letter to the chief executive officer of a company, and you say, okay, if you do not listen to us within the next 2 months, we are going to do ABC against this company. So that letter can be used as a starting point. So hopefully, if we have some nice chief executive officers, and I would like to listen from Sophia whether we have some of those later on, then they may respond. And instead of using any court or non-judicial mechanism, that could itself result in some remediation. On the other hand, it is also possible that it may have some kind of indirect effect. So we're using a mechanism, and I think one example I would like to take is national contact points. So sometimes national contact points do not provide remedy in itself, but civil society groups can use that complaint as a leverage to put pressure on companies, and that may result in some kind of indirect remediation. Now, how does it work in practice? I mean, these are initial ideas. The project has just started, and I think this work is going to continue until next year at least. So I welcome feedback, any conversations during this forum. But at this stage, I can think of this as a 3-step process. The first is the identification. What is it that the people on the ground are asking for against a company? Do they want no mining? Do they want mining should continue, but the environmental concern should be addressed? What is it that they are looking for? What kind of remediation the communities are looking for? And what are the points that we can use? And these points can be outside that particular jurisdiction where the company is operating. They could be anywhere in the world. Then the question is about the assessment. What are the most effective points that we can use in that particular case? And then we apply the pressure actually. So this is a dynamic process, and we can start with the first stage of identification after the application. So after, let us say, we try and test something, it doesn't work, then we need to go to the scoreboard again and start moving about this. Now, what is crucial in my view is, and I think that is a departure from how we see acupressure, is that in acupressure, most of the points are already known. That these are the points you press, and that's how they work. In this particular case, in my view, every company is different. So the pressure point for company A is going to be very different from pressure point for company G. And I think that is what we need expertise in identification of those pressure points that will work in this company. Because it could be a public sector enterprise, it could be a private company, it could be a company from China, it could be a company from France. How those variables are going to make a difference in terms of those pressure points. And that is where this idea of using those things in combination and using in a particular sequence is going to become very crucial, and that is where the lab is going to become a tool that could be used, hopefully, in future by affected communities. So as part of this first phase of the project, we are going to develop policy briefs that will be publicly available and accessible by anyone on these 5 pressure points. We will use a number of case studies and try to find out variables and what conditions those pressure points do work. And hopefully, we will develop and analyze 5 more pressure points as part of the second stage. And then we develop a toolkit. That will be an open access toolkit, again, which communities can use at the beginning, and that will hopefully allow it. So basically, we see this lab as kind of a connector between the affected communities and the actual remedial mechanism. So we are here, we are a bridge, and we are trying to address basically the power imbalance. That is about the information, that is about the funding, and that is about the transnational dimension of business operations. So this lab, we are starting at Macquarie Law School in Sydney, but the global vision is there, and I'm already in conversation with some other partners in different parts of the world. So basically, the idea would be to create a global network of those labs and pressure points. So basically, companies are a global network. They operate through that. So how can we learn from the same tactic and use this lab as a global network in different institutions, in different continents, and we collaborate? Let us say we have a Canadian company operating in Thailand. So how can we use the pressure point in Canada without traveling to Canada? That is the aspiration of this lab. So you will see here that we will develop tools. We will, of course, also advise and assist communities. And I think one concrete case, which I can talk later about, little bit later, I'm working with Leah, for instance, a case about Oceana Gold, an Australian mining company operating in Philippines. The lab is already working on providing an advice on this. And then we also going to connect the communities with the providers of remediation. Probably I will end it with this, but I hope that provided some flavor in terms of what this project is all about. And I'm happy to talk to anyone. And if you have any ideas also, those ideas are also very well welcome as we take this project forward to the next stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Surya. We're really excited about this opportunity to collaborate and look at how we can support on the Access to Justice labs. But you said prevention is never foolproof, and that perhaps in some ways we should be using all the tools in our advocacy box, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly, but we're going to see these results. Leah, I'm actually just going to turn over to you because, many of these pressure points that Surya just mentioned, you have used many of these in the work that you've been doing over the years now. I think particularly also in the context of the construction of mega dams in Asia. Surya also just talked about, some of these should be used in a combination or could be used as a sequence. So tell us about your experience. What pressure points do you think that were listed here, or if you've used any additional works best? And what could be the kind of combination, or is there a specific sequence? And what were your strategies when you started looking at these pressure points?
Okay, thank you. So Professor Surya already discussed the different pressure points. And coming from that, I would be presenting 3 cases to fully illustrate what we have done already. So my organization, Center for Environmental Concerns Philippines, is part of the National Alliance of Environmental Defenders that we call Environmental Defenders Congress. And from this, we have gathered the different pressure points in different situations. So the first case is the Halaur River Multipurpose Project Phase 2, which was supposed to be an irrigation, a bulk water supply, hydroelectric power, and for ecotourism. The project proponent is the National Irrigation Authority with a loan from the Economic Development Cooperation Fund from South Korea through the Export-Import Bank of Korea. So the main issues here is the lack of FPIC, or free prior informed consent. The indigenous people shared that only the good points were presented to them and not fully the negative impacts. It would also displace 17,000 individuals, which submerges 9 Tumanduk indigenous communities. There is also red tagging, or the practice of the government of naming individuals or organizations as communists or terrorists, which led to further attacks such as arbitrary arrests, torture, and the massacre of members of the local organization, 9 dead in just 1 day. So the actions we have taken regarding this started with research, and we also had an international solidarity mission where we had participants from different parts of the world to see the actual situation. We also had barricades, a dialogue with the Export-Import Bank of Korea, and we also developed relations with the UN Senior Human Rights Office in the Philippines, so we have also reported to them. And the second case is the Agna River integrated irrigation project, which the National Irrigation Authority is the proponent. The loan was supposedly from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, but it was later on funded by the Export-Import Bank of China. So the main issues here is the displacement of the traditional livelihood, which is gold panning, or the traditional way of small-scale mining, and it would impact 60 to 80 hectares of agricultural land. With this, there was a killings of members of the local Farmers Association, amounting to 17 in a span of 5 years. So with this, the local organizations conducted dialogues with the project proponent, and also a dialogue with the Japanese embassy in the Philippines. Organizations from Japan also helped us, particularly the Friends of the Earth Japan, and other organizations which helped us form an international alliance. So after this, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation pulled out of the project, but yeah, it was passed on to another funder. And the third case is the Kaliwa Dam, also for irrigation, which is part of a bigger dam project. The proponent was Metropolitan Waterworks and Sewerage System, and the loan was from the Export-Import Bank of China. So the main issues around this is the forests, around 12,000 hectares, which will be affected with endemic and endangered plant and animal species, since this is a part of a forest reserve and national wildlife sanctuary. Indigenous people will also be displaced, but there is a lack of free, prior, and informed consent. According to the World Bank, the loan is actually not economically viable, and according to the Commission on Audit, the bidding process was quote-unquote rigged, and at the process of the application and even during the operations, there was intense militarization in the community. So with this, we conducted, again, research and information education campaigns, this time using alternative media and social media, not just traditional media, which don't often cover stories such controversial as this. And we had also integration, or people-to-people solidarity, where we invite people from the cities to come to the ancestral domains to see the actual situation. We also contested the issuance of the FPIC and also the loan in the Supreme Court. So with all these experiences, along with other experiences of our network, we were able to see that research is the first crucial step to understand the situation, and this should be done with the local community to understand the actual situation, since most of the time, information is withheld, even with the FOI, a Freedom of Information Law in the Philippines. And this research helps in planning future action, including other pressure points. Direct action, such as barricades and protests, have helped in exposing the situation and in getting attention, since most of the time, even passing petitions or letters do not always result in actual action. We also used alternative media and social media, as I have mentioned, in times when the mainstream media won't cover controversial issues. And we also conducted dialogues with project proponents or funders, but that doesn't always result in success. And for us, legal action is usually one of the last recourse, since it is usually lengthy. It is a lengthy process, and it is very resource intensive and cannot often be done by local communities themselves. But what we have actually seen that is the key in all these pressure points in all our initiatives is community organizing. Having a strong local organization is very important, and being supported by national organizations or even international organizations have helped in ensuring that environmental defenders can fully do their job or their work in environmental advocacy. And as mentioned, we believe that a combination of pressure points are needed. So the three examples I have presented are not all successes. Actually, these projects have continued despite all the human rights violations. But that's the reason why we think that we should call attention to the situation of business and human rights, particularly in the Philippines, since we need to encourage more action given this kind of situation. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. I'm also kind of, hearing the words that we heard from the first session today, community organization, alliance building, collaboration. I think these are kind of the key in sort of pushing the business and human rights agenda as well. Leah, I was also very interested, in when you said it's not just, you're not just looking at social media, but also traditional media, because some of these, I think, all of us are talking so much about digitization, social media, and everything, using digital technology. But I think also we must remember the digital divide that exists, particularly in the community, particularly in the communities where we would want to run these campaigns as well. So I think one of the key messages earlier when Leah and I were speaking about was also about, when you do sort of look at these campaigns and when you're looking at designing these campaigns, look at, how are we going to reach to the people for whom we are, with whom we are working, but then also sort of the larger community. So thank you, Leah, for bringing these points here. Dr. Pilkey, I'm going to move on to you because, Surya mentioned a couple of these, examples of pressure points, and Leah has kindly elaborated on some of those that she's been able to use. You've worked on the national contact points. That's a mechanism that you have used, and so why don't you go ahead and tell us about your experience? We also just heard from Leah. Dialogues are not always successful, so our national contact points are.
To begin with, I have to tell you that I'm overwhelmed by this sense of solidarity because this is my first time to meet Leah. But concerning the first case you mentioned, the Halau Dam, I visited the area years ago when the dam is still under construction to investigate the situation because Korean companies are involved. So I think we have a lot to talk about after this session. So, as most of you know, I mean, these national contact point complaints under the OECD guidelines on multinational corporations basically deal with companies from OECD countries like Korea or Japan. It's a voluntary process for companies and people adversely affected by companies' operations, national or international. For 15 years, since 2007, I have been involved in a number of complaints to the Korean NCP, including cases concerned with, first, a crackdown of a labor union in an economic processing zone in the Philippines by Philsjon, a Korean manufacturing firm. Second, deprivation of land rights of forest dwellers to pave the way to a steel plant in India by POSCO, a Korean conglomerate. A man-made disaster of a collapse of a dam built by SKENC in Laos, which killed more than 70 people and badly affected thousands of villagers. Actually, this dam case is featured in the UNDP report. You got one of those in page 92. You can see the case in details. Since this NCP mechanism is a voluntary process, even when the government is not doing its job or companies doing nothing, there is hardly any way to force the government and the companies to become more seriously involved with this the process. For years, it was the Korean government who was not that willing to do something, very reluctant to do anything. For the first case I mentioned, the Philsjon case, the Korean NCP didn't even bother to notify the complainants that they had already dismissed the case. The reason for the dismissal was, since some judicial, quasi-judicial process is going on in the Philippines, the Korean NCP's conclusion may contradict the result of the local process in the Philippines. For the case of POSCO steel plant in India, the Korean NCP also dismissed the case in the initial assessment stage because they said since there is some judicial process going on in India, the Korean NCP process may be unnecessary duplication of the local process. Since then, there have been some changes of the composition of the Korean NCP, now having a member from a civil society, and there are some cases which went beyond initial assessment of dismissal. For the dam collapse case, Korean NCP went as far as coming up with a final statement recommending the relevant companies to provide enough remedy-related information to affected people and continue to be engaged with the complainants. We made full use of these NCP recommendations to have meetings with the companies last year and 2 years ago, last month, and have the companies facilitate our visit to disaster areas to interview the affected villagers about their livelihood, all their new houses and lands and so on, just last week. Sometimes it's extremely important to never give up and continue to mobilize certain pressure points, not just bring about changes to the cases themselves, but also to bring about changes to the power of those pressure points themselves. I always say we very often have to proactively and aggressively take it easy and take time. Thank you.
Take it easy, take time, never give up. Also, there's a disclaimer. I did not push my co-panelists here to promote the UNDPs this report, but I would strongly encourage all of you to pick up a copy of on your way out. There's also a digital copy. It's a research that we have conducted. Actually, the author, Matthew Mullen, and his team conducted research, and they conducted over 100 interviews, I think, over months during COVID, and a lot of informal discussions. So if you are interested in looking at what was happening in Asia, and largely sort of the status of business and human rights in Asia, please do pick up a copy on your way. And there's also, I think, a barcode that you can scan. But thank you so much for that. Sophia, I'm gonna move on to you now. I think there are lots of questions, in terms of, we heard just some of these examples where how some of these cases where we've tried to sort of influence the companies and the way that they function and hold businesses accountable. Give us some inside stories. How do you think businesses react to these pressure points? I mean, particularly in your role where you advise companies, when they're faced with such kind of challenges, what kind of, what are the kind of questions that they come up to you? How, what helps them navigate, but also just, your experience with them or the kind of advice that you give them. Whether they take it or not, I get it, but the kind of good advice that you give it to them, and what are some of the pressure points that you think have worked in the past? Thanks.
Thanks, Harpreet, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel, and also my co-panelists who are sharing their thoughts and insights today. I think this topic is a very important topic to bring together business and civil society and government to discuss. Just a quick note about the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. So we are a member-led organization of 22 multinationals who operate globally. We work to promote the corporate respect for human rights through peer-to-peer learning and dialogue. I'm speaking today as a member of the GBI team and not on behalf of any of our individual company members. In terms of pressure points, I think Surya has laid out, all the different pressure points that can be applied to companies. And, we know that media scrutiny, NGO reports, and shareholder resolutions can push company action. Companies do react to this. CEOs don't want to see their companies in the newspaper for causing harm to people and for abusing human rights. So investor pressure is also an effective tool. Companies respond to their investors, and having pressure from their investors increasingly regarding human rights and environmental concerns is another important tool that can elicit company action. And these pressure points can get a company reaction. You can get a company to try and engage in remedy and push them to take action through this. I think we've all seen many examples of this over the years. But however, sometimes the reaction of the company is not ideal. So along those lines, direct and public approaches can be effective, but they can also backfire. and they can have consequences. You can send companies running for the hills or for their lawyers, resulting in leaving projects to remove future risks to the company rather than staying and working to try and improve the situation and on non-repetition, or using their leverage to improve the situation, or potentially souring community rights holder relations and building mistrust. Litigation and specific instance complaints may also have the effect of taking the issue out of the hands of those who can engage with communities and put it in the hands of the legal departments, which will limit the opportunities for engagement and dialogue with communities and affected rights holders. So in terms of, what we say when people come to us, I think the UNGPs provide a very important grounding and framing for companies when it comes to this conversation. The UNGPs call for business to constructively engage in access to remedy, and they offer a common language for business and civil society to do so. Engaging in remedy can be a very sensitive topic for business. Business normally is not the good guy in the situation. They're the bad actor. But the UNGPs are meant to create the common language for business to be able to engage constructively in facilitating remedy. And we've seen a change in business attitudes since the development of the UNGPs. We've seen this through more transparent reporting processes where companies are willing to be more forthcoming about their adverse human rights impacts. And we've also seen a change in business attitudes around civil society. So business views civil society as a valued partner and informant to prevent and mitigate human rights risks. Civil society can offer an eye to the ground that sometimes business cannot access themselves, though we must be very clear that civil society and human rights defenders should not do the company's dirty work and put themselves at risk. And we've seen this also through multi-stakeholder collaboration to achieve remedy. So at GBI, over the past 10 years, we've worked with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center to present a number of multi-stakeholder case studies at the UN Annual Forum to demonstrate the benefits of addressing issues and remedy and looking at non-repetition through multi-stakeholder collaboration and cooperation. Multi-stakeholder approaches to remedy can raise standards within industries or on specific issues, but they also need to address contextual issues, addressing systemic human rights risks as remedial processes play out in the context of operation. And this can be understood as pillars 1, 2, and 3 being addressed in parallel and in real time. Multi-stakeholder remedial efforts, which are thoughtfully constructed and consistently reviewed to ensure that they are fit for purpose, can be effective and long-lasting tools to providing remedial outcomes for individuals and impacted communities. And such collaboration can assist with dispelling assumptions different stakeholder groups make of each other in order to effectively hear one another, and foster respect necessary to ensure truly effective remedy, and importantly, non-repetition. Understanding how all parties are received and how they perceive each other can flag the need for some misconception and assumption busting to facilitate a constructive dialogue around access to remedy. So what else would I recommend to companies? I think there are a few areas where companies could certainly benefit from a better understanding. First, when things go wrong, the power disparity between stakeholders can be vast, between companies and affected people, or even within a group of affected people themselves. These disparities can shape how grievances are dealt with, what outcomes are achieved, and how the company's response is perceived by others. So finding ways to identify, understand, and be sensitive to these power disparities can help companies find a more effective way to respond to grievances. And second, a better, more nuanced understanding of the suite of remedial tools, apology, guarantees of non-repetition, etc., and really working with the communities to understand what tools should be used. I think the default pursuance of financial compensation only is not necessarily in the rights holder's interest. And lastly, and I think this is for business, but of course to all involved civil society and government as well, there should be a focus on achieving a meaningful outcome for rights holders. When we talk about litigation, business in particular should consider the effects of litigation on affected peoples and communities, as they are often left in limbo for years. Putting the rights holder at the center of the process and providing effective remedy for affected people also offers an opportunity for companies to build trust and deepen their relationship with stakeholders. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Harpreet.
Thanks, Sophia. I do have some follow-up questions here, but I think maybe if we could also just, I think it'd be good to also just hear if any of the participants here have any questions for the panelists here, and then we'll come back to you guys for the second round.
I think so.
Sounds good. Okay. Please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Be very brief if you have a question or any comment to make.
Regarding the dam in the Philippines, the natural resources of a country belongs to all the citizens of the country, not just for the 15,000 indigenous people. I live in the city. I need my water. I also need my power. There are 15,000 in the tribal areas where the water is located. There are 30 million in the city. So I think the human groups, the defenders, should not just go there and object. They must also balance their objections according to the greater needs. I pay my taxes in the city. Because of my hard work in the city, we have foreign exchange to buy oil and gas that mostly highly subsidized for your kind of people who live in the indigenous areas. During the COVID pandemic, taxpayers in the city paid for the vaccines that all of you also used. So there has to be two ways in how to resolve these issues. And in any business, or even big projects like a dam, there's already built-in remedies for those people who will be displaced, like relocation, right? Like compensation already built in. So, may I suggest that you have to do better. If you sit down and ask for a better place to relocate, more compensation, request for better road access, they can build you better schools, they can build you medical clinic, and I'm sure there will be workers in the dam. They should also be able to use whatever technology is available there. So my point here is, human right is good, but it has to be balanced for all. There has to be a magic balance. Thank you.
ครับก็สวัสดีครับผมรุ่งเรืองรัมัญญะนะครับผู้ประสานงานเครือข่ายชนะรักถิ่นนะครับครับผมรุ่งเรืองรัมัญญะนะครับผู้ประสานงานเครือข่ายชนะรักถิ่นนะครับก็คือ ผมเนี่ย อยากทราบว่าบริษัท TPIPP เนี่ยเป็นใครมาจากไหนแล้วก็ได้เงินทุนลงทุนมาจากไหนนะครับแล้วก็อยากทราบว่าไอ้บริษัทเหล่านี้เนี่ยก็คือมีรัฐบาลหนุนหลังไหมนะครับที่ผมถามอย่างนี้เพราะว่าในชุมชนของผมมีความกังวลนะครับเพราะว่าบริษัทเหล่านี้เนี่ยได้ไปทำการลงทุนซื้อที่ดินไว้เนี่ยเป็นหมื่นไร่แล้วก็ที่ดินที่ซื้อมากๆจำนวนหมื่นไร่เนี่ยแน่นอนล่ะมันต้องไปทับที่สาธารณะแล้วก็ต้องไปทับที่ชาวบ้านซึ่งสิ่งเหล่านี้เนี่ยมันก็เป็นการละเมิดสิทธิ์เป็นการที่ทำให้ชาวบ้านเดือดร้อนและอีกอย่างหนึ่งสิ่งที่ผมเป็นกังวลมากๆเลยก็คือที่อำเภอจะนะของผมตอนนี้เนี่ยมันมีโรงงานอยู่แล้วเนี่ย145โรงซึ่งทั้ง145โรงเหล่านี้เนี่ยต่างก็กำลังละเมิดสิทธิ์ชุมชนก็คือมีการปล่อยน้ำเสียลงในที่สาธารณะซึ่งอำเภอจะนะเนี่ย มีทั้งทะเลแล้วก็มีคลอง2 คลองซึ่งเป็นเส้นเลือดใหญ่ในการหล่อเลี้ยงคนสงขลาและอาเซียน
Can you be a little bit brief, please?
นะครับ
Thank you.
ก็ฝากไว้แค่นี้นะครับขอบคุณครับ
May I speak?
Yes, please.
Thank
Go
you
ahead.
so much. I wanted to, thanks for the panelists. It was really informative, especially the first one. So my point is, I think we really need to reimagine and rethink hydropower as renewable energy. So if you look at so I'm Bhanu Tatak. I come from the Arunachal Pradesh, China border. So I am with the collective Dibang Resistance. It's an anti-dam movement. We strongly oppose hydropower push in our region without any free, prior, or informed consent of the people by big banks, transnational banks, national banks, PSUs, and the government of India, without really acknowledging the region as a self-determined area. I mean, I think I'm not just addressing the indigenous issue here, but also looking at the so the Tibetan glaciers is controlled by China, and if you look from the angle of IPCC as well, according to Brazil's National Institute of Space Research, 170 million tons of methane and carbon dioxide is released. So the greenwashing of hydro is really not, I think it really needs to be reimagined. And given that there have been communities forever protesting, giving their lives killed and also forever protesting. They've grown old and aged. And so I think UN intervention with China also, because essentially the glacier that's being, the Tibetan glacier that controls the South Asian rivers there is controlled by China. More than several dams have been built there. So is there any international treaty or pact that is possible, to have a dialogue with China, since they don't release they're not transparent with the data. So that's my question to you. And also really to reimagine hydropower as renewable. So I completely disagree that it's a renewable source of energy. Thank you.
So regarding the first intervention, there was no part in the presentation saying that we should not meet the needs of the people in the city. It is not the people in the cities versus the indigenous people. But what we're saying here is that we do not want development aggression, and one need should not go against the human rights of others. So there are already mechanisms on how we should address the needs, water needs in the city, and there are already mechanisms to do this, or technologies such as development water catchment systems and harvesting water from other areas, which do not necessarily have to entail displacement of indigenous communities, which is also part of the state's responsibility to protect those who are marginalized and protect those who have special needs. And second, regarding subsidizing the needs of indigenous people, they are subsidized particularly because they cannot address these needs for themselves. And it is part of the government's responsibility to provide for all. So taxes are should be utilized by all. And I just would like to address the notion that we're going against each other here. We would like to help each other, and we are here all for human rights for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Surya, do you want to add any response?
Thank you. I just have 3 quick points to make. First of all, I think the idea of this project and other projects about access to remedy, in a sense, in my view, is this. Can businesses put human rights on the top shelf? Is human rights same important as making profit, or is it less important? Because businesses, many of them at least, I'm aware of, they think respecting human rights is a journey. So we're walking slowly towards the journey. But making profit is never a slow journey. Can we put human rights and profit at the same level? That is what the struggle of business and human rights, in my view, is. Can we achieve that? And if we cannot achieve, then I think we are just scratching the surface. My second comment is kind of a slight response to the first intervention from the floor. I hope we can have calm discussion around those issues rather than accusing and pointing fingers about those issues about each other. In my view, the power of human rights is that not about 15,000 people, even 15 people's rights cannot be sacrificed. Forget about 15,000 versus 13 million. That is the power of human rights. But then the human rights jurisprudence has tools to strike the balance between rights of some people and rights of other people. So I think we have those tools. But I think it will be a false narrative to suggest that simply because of a greater good, we can sacrifice the rights of 15,000 people wherever they are in the world. I think that is, in my view, an unacceptable narrative, because right of even one person could be equally important as the right of 6 billion people. That is the power of human rights, in my view. My last point is about, I like the word reimagination. So I think we need to reimagine many things. In my view, the whole idea of free market economy, the capitalism, I think we need to reimagine many things if we have to succeed in going forward, including hydropower and including the idea of renewable energy. Because many situations of renewable energy may not be responsible energy. How do we ensure that the renewable energy is also responsible in line with the BHR standards? I think that is a challenge that we need to deal with, in my view. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Surya. Sophia, there was a very specific question for GBI, but it wasn't sort of focused on the session. If you want to respond very briefly, and maybe perhaps you can have a conversation bilaterally later.
Yes, thanks, Harpreet. And I was actually going to respond in my response to the next question, but I can do so now very quickly. For the gentleman from southern Thailand and your questions about understanding, who is the company that is in your community and operating there. I think that's a really important question, and I think that's something that many communities struggle with, because there's often a lack of transparency about who companies are, who the investors are, and how you can apply pressure if you don't understand who owns the companies, who's behind them, and who's supporting them. In my remarks later, I was going to speak about, trying to understand the company and how that's important when you design your pressure points. But I think you touched on something very important in that there is often a lack of transparency. So what do you do in that situation? And I think Leah, in her presentation, really showed how they addressed, they had companies, but they addressed their issues by going to different partners. So for example, going to the Japanese embassy, going to the export bank, going to whatever information that they were able to get about companies, about that company, going to those entities to try and push and try and apply pressure, even if there was maybe a lack of transparency around the company itself.
Thanks, Sophia. Dr. Pilkyu, if I could ask the next question to you. We've heard sort of these different approaches, different tools that are available. And you come sort of with a lot of legal background. How do you think these, the legal community can complement some of these approaches while focusing on judicial mechanisms to access remedy? Just in terms of, what you think are the best combinations or something that you've tried and worked best?
So, I'd like to make it clear that when we talk about lawyers are focusing on judicial mechanisms and while complementing or supporting non-judicial mechanisms, it's not the case in reality. Lawyers, non-lawyers, academics, and activists, they work together. Even when we talk about non-judicial mechanism, it's a legal issue very often. It's not legally binding issue, but it's a legal issue. And so I think it's important to have all these different actors, interdisciplinary, interfield, work together to have advocacy work in different issues and areas. So, there are a number of these different tactics and strategies and different mechanisms and different pressure points. And we have to kind of map all these different pressure points with all these different actors working together. That's the point I want to make.
Thank you. Surya, I'm going to come back to you. You started by introducing some of these pressure points. We discussed some of the examples here, in terms of some of the examples or some of the pressure points that Leah and Pilq have used. Sophia talked about the kind of experiences or the kind of responses that companies have. But what are some of the limitations do you think these pressure points have, and how do we address them? Because we've started looking at while we are reimagining everything, we're also sort of looking at this new methodologies or new approaches that we're bringing in here. What are some of the limitations we must understand that we're working with, and are there any thoughts in terms of how we could address those? Thanks, Surya. Floor's yours.
Thank you. Yes, I think no one should get an impression from this session that the pressure points will work in all situations. So I think there are definitely various limitations. And I think that is where a combination of pressure points is one way to mitigate the limitations, right? So I mean, again, I could draw the analogy with the medicine, right? So when you go to a doctor may give you a number of medicines, a combination, right? So if they give you antibiotics, they also give you vitamins to counterbalance the side effects, right? So I think the question is, how do we use those pressure points in a combination that the limitation of one pressure point can be mitigated, if not completely taken out, by the another pressure points. I think that dynamic combination is one way which is quite crucial. The other limitation I see is the lack of transparency. I think that is already highlighted by two of them. If, let us say, two lawyers start finding out the corporate structure of a company, multinational, it is extremely difficult to find that information publicly available. It's extremely difficult. So how do you apply and identify those pressure points if you can't even trace that this company is incorporated where and who has shareholding and to what percentage? So I think we need a reform of corporate law to mandate businesses that they have to disclose these things. And if there is more transparency, then the pressure points will become more dynamic. The other challenge I see is that businesses and governments are having a nexus. So this state and business, so many businessmen are politicians, including businesswomen. So I think this nexus of the decision makers in the private sector and in the government sector, and they are often siding together, then that creates a limitation because you don't see the government actors as your allies all the time. So I think there are many, many limitations, but this project will look at those limitations and then try to think of the strategies that how can we minimize those limitations or overcome those limitations. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. So reimagine and reform to put people and profit at the same pedestal is what we are looking forward. There's actually a question online, Surya, that asks, and they're asking where the documents are about this project. And do you want to respond? I know you just mentioned that we've just started. So I think in the due course, we will, all of this material is going to be publicly available and we would announce. So keep following our Twitter. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, so I think the project has just started, last week or so. The idea, it has been a work in progress for many, many years. I had this idea, and Pilq, you may remember, we established the Access to Justice Network and all this. So I think this idea has been with me for many years, but now finally I'm getting a chance to implement and execute it. So these documents will be available publicly next year, but we will build a website of the lab very shortly, and then it can be shared with anyone, and all the information will be posted on that website. Thank you.
Thanks. There's also a question online, if I could take that, and any of you could answer. It says, due to lack of law enforcement, people find it challenging to get assistance from the government. Could you suggest any approaches where business workers and local communities can use for accessing or facilitating access to remedy?
I can give a quick answer, and then my colleagues on the panel can respond and complement what I'm saying. There is no magic solution, and the communities, so I say power imbalance. There's power imbalance about information, there's power imbalance about the funding, there's power imbalance about the expertise. It's about the communities based in a local region, but the companies having a team of lawyers and advisors working transnationally. So I think these are power imbalances. Now the question is, how can some of us in this room play their part in addressing those power imbalances? So I think this lab is one of those attempts to address those power imbalances. So if cases come to us, because I've been working with my law students every year, So those law students will be trying to do research and do some heavy lifting, and then we provide some advice in those particular cases to the communities. So I think that is a way to address those power imbalances.
Sure. Thanks, Surya. While we're sort of talking about this lab, sort of still in process, Leah, you've been working very closely with civil society organizations. What's your experience been, Leah? Do you think there are any existing gaps, and how can we address in either, addressing these gaps with the civil society so that they can access and they can use these pressure points more effectively? Thanks.
From our work, we have seen that there is an actual lack of knowledge on human rights standards, because many of these kinds of situations I've discussed have been happening for a long time. It's even difficult for communities to see what should be happening or what are their rights. And there are also lack of knowledge on human rights mechanisms, as mentioned earlier, both at the local and at the international level, and even this dispute mechanisms that corporations have. And many local communities have a lack of capacity, for example, on how to access these mechanisms. It is even difficult for them to document what is happening, and more so writing documents about it or reports about it. So with the digital divide, as mentioned, there is a difficulty in accessing this information. And there is also a lack of government support and action. For example, these situations are already in the media. So how do we go to the communities and ask what we can do to help? I believe there is also a lack of mechanisms in place. If there were, these killings would not have happened. These human rights violations would not have gone on for a long time. And I think the biggest challenge that we are facing now is how human rights defenders are seen. Red tagging, as I mentioned before, is a very dangerous tool that is being used now. Even my organization has been red tagged twice. We have been surveilled. There has been a threat of raid in our office. So this danger is real. And for us, we are based in the city. What more for those who are based in the provinces? So I think pressure points can be done, but the danger to the defender security is one of the main issues that we should be facing, or we should address at this point.
Thanks, Leah, for bringing those really important points about lack of awareness, lack of capacity, but also just making sure that we are not harming, and the defenders are safe. They're also safe when they're fighting and defending rights for everyone as well.
Thank you very much. I'm Tek. I work for UNDP Nepal. I have a small query for Surya. Thank you, Surya, for your impressive and inspiring presentation. My question is in regard to the role of the national human rights institutions, of course, and the emerging trends of South Asia establishing separate thematic issue-based commissions, because they are, after all, the quasi-judicial mechanism can contribute a lot in addressing, from, of course, the preventive and the remedial part of redressal. So that is what I wanted to hear a bit more about. The second question is about the role of legal academics as well, because again, preventive part includes research and studies based on which you may, kind of use these strategic litigations. So yeah, these are the two things.
Great.
Wanted to, hear a bit more. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tek.
Thank you so much. I'm Ummi Laila, and I'm representing HomeNet Pakistan from Pakistan. So I have two questions, one for Surya and one for Sophia. So thank you so much for giving this idea of reimagining the lab concept and whatever you have mentioned about the pressure points. I think that's something that we need to typically have in practice within the countries and within the transnationals. We have to identify the gaps, and we have to create the synergies according to their capacities of the transnational companies. So I agree with that. Having said that, the solution, I think, do you think, as Sophia mentioned, that having the business and human rights resource center is the solution for that lab concept that you have provided. So that's a mix of the question. And I just wanted to highlight here that there's a difference between theory and practice. So in practice, what we have in South Asia is a totally denial of the human rights. So there are violations going on. The complaint mechanism, the remedial mechanisms are there on papers, but on existing, we do not have such mechanisms where the workers in the supply chains do not report just because of the fear of losing their jobs. So we have to create acceptance within the transnational, within the corporate sector, within the private sector, within the supply chains. We have to create the acceptance of human rights violation within those entities who are responsible for this, and bridge the gap.
Sorry, if you could also be very brief.
So that's just I just wanted to highlight. I think they have got the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe just one last question here.
I, Nilambor Gogoi, age 75, on behalf of indigenous people of Mungdon Sonkam, Assam, Northeast India, have a question regarding big dam for hydroelectric project. In the name of development or business, big dam is being constructed in Assam, India, without free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people by Article 32 within bracket 2 of UNDP 2007. The big dam is a direct threat to life and property of indigenous people, as well as detrimental to the ecological balance of the region. Actually, the big dam is in Lower Subansiri constructed by authority, ignoring public protest and expert committee report. Therefore, we invite you to visit the site. This is clear violation of FPIC and UN guidelines. What is your suggestion?
So thank you for the question, and I think just to understand, it was about how to push the human rights in a place where human rights is not often talked about. So how to get the companies to be comfortable speaking about human rights and understanding how they should respect human rights. And I think in those contexts, there has to be sometimes a language switch where you use the language that companies do understand. The language around risks, the language around due diligence. You can use the language for different industries. I think in the past we've had examples around using very specific language for the hospitality industry, where communities can be sort of considered as guests, and that was helpful in terms of conveying the conversation. A lot of this is internal discussions within companies. So being able to identify those in a company that you can engage with and have those conversations with them about the concerns of communities in languages that they understand can be a really helpful tool in furthering their understanding about human rights and their impacts on human rights and continuing the dialogue.
I think from what have been shared, what we are seeing is that there is a lack of mechanisms, or there are mechanisms in place that are not implemented. And from this, I just would like to echo from the previous panel, sharing that we have recommendatory policies, or we have guidelines, but how do we ensure that these are actually implemented? As mentioned earlier also, these are also voluntary. So I think that's what we can think about. That's why we're all here. How to improve this kind of situation wherein what we're talking about now will be actually seen on the ground.
I think that the important thing is we have to kind of see the details, the real situation on the ground. When I visited the Halau Dam area, many villagers, they haven't been notified that their villages will be actually submerged. So, if you don't know the situation, we cannot have the solutions. Even though we can have different ideas, different opinions, but we can start from the reality on the ground. And I just want to say that, it's all about, we have to show that we have serious concerns, and that serious concerns cannot be ignored. And we can, with all these different ideas and different opinions, we can occupy the biggest room in the world together, the room for improvement and change. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm hearing documentation, from both of you as well in terms of sort of identifying what the issues are, but also documenting that well. Surya, do you want to take the floor? And also if you could just add your closing remarks with that.
Sure. So let me quickly respond to a couple of specific questions. One question was about the role of NHRIs and legal academics. So I would say academics and law students can try to address power imbalances. I think that's a key role. And I think this lab is trying to harness that precise role. And the ultimate goal would be to create such labs in many, many countries, so that instead of these communities struggling, where should they go, these students and law scholars and lawyers who are willing to work together, they can come to the communities and try to help them address this power imbalance. NHRIs could in fact be a pressure point, and hopefully we'll deal with that in part second phase of the project. But the crucial thing will be that whether the NHRI is independent or not. Independent not merely on paper, but in practice. Because I have heard about NHRIs which have A status, but they are not perceived to be independent by the communities. I think that is a very crucial point. Whether lab is the solution, lab is not the solution, but it's part of the solution in my view. And it's an experiment, and I think we should keep an eye on consultation processes, because these briefs will be done in consultation with the experts, civil society groups. So please watch out for those calls where we try to gather this data from all of you and create some publicly accessible tools that can be used by anyone, anywhere in the world. Thank you very much for having us in this session.
Great. Thanks, Surya. Sophia, would you like to give your closing remarks, please?
Thanks, Harpreet. So I think globally we're currently seeing different patchworks of pressure being used. We're seeing legislation coming out of the EU and Latin America. We're seeing litigation in Europe and Latin America as well. The recent forced labor bans coming out of the EU and the US. And I think it's generally, though, it's hard to say that one pressure point will work in any given time or place. And each company, as we've discussed, is different. Businesses are not monoliths. So I think for the rights holders, it's important to understand the individual company and its operating context. And we've talked today that can be challenging, and there can be a lack of transparency. But as much as possible, trying to understand the structure, the internal governance processes, the internal mechanisms of the company is extremely important. Sometimes there are allies within companies, believe it or not, but they also face barriers internally to pushing things forward. But trying to understand a bit more about the company and its context can be extremely important. And then I think also determining the clear objectives of the pressure. What is it that you're trying to achieve is extremely important. We had a very quick example in terms of a multinational that was being pressured to respond to a situation where a natural resource was polluted. And the multinational looked around, and it actually realized that in this situation it was not at fault, but the national companies around the multinational, some of whom were the business partners, were at fault. And in that case, the multinational could be a very important lever to pushing change for the ultimate solution, which was getting the natural resource to no longer be polluted so that communities could use it. So, really, we talked about analyzing the situation, but I think also analyzing the company and the operating context and the objectives of what you're trying to achieve can be extremely important in thinking about the pressure points that can be applied to companies. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you. Can I have a big round of applause for our panelists here today? Thank you very much.